believe that everybody needs wisdom. What if our choices and decisions that we made were wise choices? What if as parents or grandparents, we made wise parenting and grandparenting decisions? What if we knew exactly what to do in any kind of a situation because we had that sense of wisdom? And what if on our best days we weren't just smart or learned or maybe a little bit intelligent? What if we were actually wise? Because the people that I know that I would call wise, it's different than just smart. I mean, it's smart, but it's more than that. It's different than just intelligent. There's something else there that makes me call them wise. The Bible's book of Proverbs is this book that we've been looking through for the past number of weeks. And if there's any book in the Bible that talks about wisdom more than any other book, it is Proverbs. And Proverbs is first-hand information and insight about wisdom. Because its author, King Solomon, is one who had first-hand experience with wisdom. And when King Solomon wrote this, it says over and over in this book, it describes why he was writing it. It's as if King Solomon, who is a father and a son, was passing on the wisdom and insight that he had learned in his life to his children. It says this over and over, I am a father and obey my instructions. I'm giving this to my children. It's a very father-to-child type of thing. And for King Solomon, passing it on to all of his children, he's passing this wisdom on to the nation of Israel, over whom he is king. So here's a little glimpse of what that looks like in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 4. My children, listen when your father corrects you. Pay attention and learn good judgment, for I am giving you good guidance. Don't turn away from my instructions, for I too was once my father's son, tenderly loved as my mother's only child. My father taught me, take my words to heart, follow my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom, develop good judgment. Getting wisdom is the wisest thing you can do. Getting wisdom is the wisest thing you can do. I mean, Proverbs says over and over to go get wisdom. Find it, seek it, use all your resources to go and get it, use your time, use everything you have to go get wisdom. It's that valuable and it's that important. Finding wisdom is the wisest thing we could do. But the problem is, getting wisdom is kind of tricky. I mean, you can't go buy it at a store. You can't go online and get it from Amazon. You can't take a test and earn it and get a certificate that says you're wise. Wisdom doesn't work quite that way. Getting wisdom is a little bit tricky. Wisdom, as we've seen in the past few weeks, at least according to Proverbs' point of view, comes through a relationship with God. When any one of us has a relationship with God and we live in that relationship with God, wisdom tends to emerge. It tends to come over time. As we invest and we are involved in a relationship with God, then wisdom tends to come out. We find wisdom and insight and a perspective and a way of seeing things that are God's ways as we spend more time with God. We develop a sense of wisdom. Of course, we can never be fully wise, but we develop glimpses and times when we become wise or do maybe wise things because of that investment with God. And I fully believe that. And we've talked about that idea that wisdom comes out of a relationship with God. The problem with that is that it's not very specific. To say wisdom comes out of a relationship with God is true, but what does it mean to invest and be involved in a relationship with God to the extent that wisdom comes out of it? How can we get specific to say, well, what does that mean? And what does that look like? And how do we do that? A couple weeks ago when we talked about worship and wisdom, we did get a little bit specific. We practiced different ways of worshiping, and you all were wonderful in joining in that. And it was a load of fun, and I think it was a great experience to try worshiping in different ways to see how wisdom can come from worshiping God and reconnecting us in this relationship with God. The cool thing is, Proverbs reveals two more very specific things that we can do to find wisdom in a relationship with God. And the even cooler thing is, this is perfect for Father's Day, because these are two things that we fathers do not do very well. So I want to check these two things out with you. There's a turning point in Solomon's life, and it was when he found wisdom. Solomon was King David's son. And if you remember anything about King David, if you can think anything about King David was the king that everybody celebrated, that everybody said if there was ever a great king, it was King David. He had the biggest armies, and he did the greatest things, and he grew this nation of people. So people said if there was ever a great king, it was King David. So when King David is done, his son Solomon becomes king. And as you can imagine, King Solomon is he's overwhelmed. I mean, how do you rule a country in the shoes of this king who was the greatest ever, that people talk about all the time and celebrate? I mean, he was completely overwhelmed with what to do. So, he had a conversation with God, and it went like this. 1 Kings chapter 3. That night the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Solomon replied, "Oh my Lord, my God, you have made me king instead of my father David, but I'm like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted. Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice, and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has had or ever will have." Does it seem to you like Solomon is in a relationship with God? I mean, does this passage, this description, indicate that maybe Solomon was in a relationship with God? I would say yes. He was talking with God. God was talking with him. There was this conversation going on. There were questions. There was response. There was some satisfaction going on. I mean, they had a relationship that was happening. And in the midst of that relationship, what does Solomon ask for? He asks for wisdom. How does he get wisdom? He asks for it. Jesus famously said, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you." Much later in the Bible, the book of James says, "If anyone lacks wisdom, they should ask our generous God." And then in Ephesians, Paul says, "We are confident that God hears us whenever we ask for anything. We also know that God will give us what we ask for." The Bible calls us to ask. And if we need something, ask God. The thing is, I think it takes guts to ask. I mean, we did this community prayer. We prayed for people. We prayed for things just a few minutes ago. We do this every week. That takes guts. I mean, we're praying for big things. We're praying for people to be healed of diseases for which there's no cure. I mean, we're praying for people to find comfort in the death of loved ones. We're celebrating God for doing things that we say, God did that, and it's a miracle. I mean, that takes guts to pray for that stuff. I think it's one thing to ask God for something, but I think the risk comes when we don't know if God's going to give it. Because who knows what God's going to do in answering or responding to the prayers that we pray, but we still ask. And God invites us over and over again, through King Solomon's example, throughout the Bible, to just ask. Because who is it that we're asking? We're asking a pretty incredible God. Jesus said this, "Parents, if your children ask for a loaf of bread, do you give them a stone instead? Or if they ask for a fish, do you give them a snake? Of course not. So if you sinful people know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good gifts to those who ask him?" It's risky to ask God for things because we don't know what's going to happen. But we get to ask the God of the universe, who's created us and created everything, who's done miracles and still does miracles. We get to come before God and just ask for things. and trust that God is going to respond in the best way that's fit for that situation. We are in a great position because of a great God to just ask. Speaking of positions, there's an interesting thing in the Jewish world about positions that they got into when they were worshiping God or asking God for things. In fact, there were two positions that became especially popular in the Jewish faith in the biblical times and all the way up to the present. The first one was standing. Oftentimes, the people, when they would be in settings of worship or asking God about things, they would stand. And this became very common at certain points. In fact, there's a prayer that's still prayed in the Jewish faith. It's one of the most popular prayers that's prayed every day if you're a very faithful Jewish person. We've talked about it before, I think. It's called the Amidah prayer. They pray it in the morning and in the evening. And do you know what Amidah means? Standing prayer. It's meant to be prayed standing. And what they often do is they'll take 3 steps forward as they begin the prayer, and they'll pray, and then they'll take 3 steps back as they end the prayer, as if they're approaching God as they pray, and then they retreat from God after they pray. And it's standing prayer. It's a sign of respect. It's a sign of, this is important, so I'm going to stand. Interestingly, reading through the Gospels, we often see that when Jesus went into the synagogues and he taught, what did he do before he taught? It said Jesus began to teach and he sat down. And that's not what we do. Somebody teaches, a professor in a class or a teacher in a room, they stand up. That's not how they did it. The teacher would sit, and guess who would stand? Everybody else. Everybody else would stand up, because to them, then that's a sign that I am encountering something that God is giving me. And so I'm going to stand to be attentive to that and to be respectful of that. So standing was hugely popular. And we do this too, don't we? We have habits of standing. What happens when you start to hear the Star-Spangled Banner? Up on your feet. What happens when the bride enters a wedding? Up on your feet. We have habits even here at church. We stand at certain times to sing songs. We stand for certain things. We stand because it feels like we're giving ourselves to what God is doing, or we're respecting the thing that's happening. The other position that was really, really popular in the Jewish faith, and still is the position of kneeling. It was actually the position that was part of what they called bowing. And what they would do is they would get on their knees, and they would either bow all the way to the ground, so they'd be on their knees but lying on the ground, or they just get on their knees and sit straight up. And when they would get on their knees and do this was at certain times too, certain times of prayer, or certain times when other things would happen during a time of worship or in their own practice of their faith, there was this practice of kneeling. And kneeling was always associated with 2 things. It was either associated with confessing sin, or being ashamed of sin, or receiving a blessing. So whether it was confessing sin or receiving a blessing, I think the idea behind it is that we're not worthy of whatever's happening. God is God, we're not, so we're going to put ourselves in a position that shows that we're not worthy of this, but God is. Kneeling is a fascinating position. When I think of kneeling, I think of Psalm 95 that says, "Come, let us worship and bow down, let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker." In the prophets, Daniel, it says in Daniel chapter 6, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he has always done, giving thanks to God. And then in Ephesians it says, "When I think of all this, I fall to my knees and pray to the Father." Kneeling is a way of showing God who God is. It's a way of being in a certain position that makes us feel a certain way. And kneeling is a way that puts us in a place to be able to ask for big things, even things like wisdom. The Pope, who was the Pope before the current one, Pope Benedict, he wrote this about kneeling. He said, "A faith no longer familiar with kneeling would be sick at the core." And And I think his idea is that if we forget the idea of kneeling, if we forget what that means and what that does in our faith, we've lost something. And it's not just that kneeling is magic. It's not that we get on our knees and something automatically happens. But there's something about being in a certain position that says something to us and says something to God. We moved into our house when we moved here to town 10 years ago, and our backyard was empty. It had dirt, and a lot of dirt, and we did not want dirt. We wanted something better than dirt. So we just started designing what we wanted for our backyard to look like, and started putting in step by step what we wanted for our backyard. One of the first things that we put in was a paver patio. And we designed the whole thing out, and we planned how to do it. Now, I had never put in a paver patio before. Thanks be to God that my father-in-law had done things like this before, and he was a great source of wisdom and help. So he had assessed for us that we had certain tools, and we did not have certain tools for the job. We had shovels, we had rakes, we had a few other things that would help us with the job, but we lacked certain things. So we ordered our supplies, and we even bought a few tools like levels and rakes and line levels and string and stakes and other things you need to make a good paver patio. Well, as we started the project, we began right before some other of our family showed up, and when they did show up, they blessed me with a small tool that helped in this task. And the tool was these wonderful kneeling pads. They said, you're going to be spending a lot of time on your knees in the next day. And let me tell you, these kneeling pads were so important for that job. What if we had a habit of kneeling? Especially fathers. What if we had a habit of kneeling? Of not just doing the act and doing the position, but what if we had the heart and the desire and the passion to say, God, you are God and I am not, and I recognize that I need you now. It's caused me to think actually a lot about my own habit of kneeling, which isn't much of a habit. I reserve kneeling personally for times when there's something big happening, something that I don't know what to do with, something that I don't know where to go with. And so it's rare that I will kneel, but it's always by myself. I rarely ever kneel around anybody else. It's my way of doing what we've talked about. There is one habit, though, that I do have of kneeling. And it was a habit that developed a few years ago. It happens on Sunday mornings, and it's the first thing I do when I get up in the morning. I go downstairs, and I kneel in a certain chair, and I pray. I pray for several specific things. I confess. I pray for the worship service that's happening, that I get to be part of that day. I pray for RiverCross Church, and I pray for God's plans at the church, and I pray for God's plans for that day. It's very short, and it's brief. And I'll tell you, kneeling feels weird. It feels strange. I mean, it's not standing, it's not sitting, it's not something we normally do. And to me, it feels weird. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay that it does feel weird, because it prompts me to realize I'm doing something different because I believe that God is about to do something different. So I'm going to kneel and invite that to happen. Fathers especially, what if we knelt? What if we knelt for our families? What if we knelt for our church? What if we knelt for our community? For the friends, for the people we know who we don't know how to fix the things that are going on? What if we knelt as a way of saying, God, you are the one who can work here, and I can't do it? I think if there's ever a position to ask God for big things, it's the position of kneeling. And again, it's not magic, but it's a way of saying, God, you are an amazing God, and I need you now. Can I pray for us?